Hey, welcome back everyone to Application Security Weekly. We got the announcements out of the way, so we're just going to dive right into, I think we're going to start with devdocs.io before we get into some news. I've just started poking around in this. This is fascinating, Keith.
I think you're really going to like it, Paul. I mean, as a tool, I have to admit it. So I used this when I was flying out to San Francisco last week, building out.
Hey, Keith, I can't hear you. If we could cut the music. The music is really loud in my headphones. I really like it, though.
No, it's good. It's good. And so what I was saying was devdocs.io is a really interesting tool it's open source. It's free to use. The reason that I like it, though, is it allows you to choose which frameworks, libraries, documentation that you want to go ahead and cache to your browser, and then you can use it offline. And the reason that I really liked it is when I was flying out to San Francisco last year to go on site for BugCrowd at headquarters, I had a 6.5-hour flight, and I had a presentation that I was working on building. So I needed some Bootstrap and some CSS information so that I could make sure that it came together in the way that I wanted, because I was writing that presentation in Impress.js. And to that end, it was kind of nice being able to say, okay, I don't have to rely on maybe a little bit shoddy Wi-Fi on the plane or even buy Wi-Fi on the plane. I just have this documentation at my fingertips. For those that aren't familiar with things like Git, for example, they even have technologies like Git in terms of how to go ahead and use that for debugging or administration or any number of other things that you might do in terms of patching. And then they even have languages, so Go, Python, frameworks such as AngularJS and React, as well as, of course, things like server-side information. So Nginx is a good example of one of the ones that I have, Apache HTTP server. And yeah, it's been pretty expansive and it continues to grow. It is an open source project. So I actually have the link to the GitHub project as well. So you can run this locally as your own kind of server on your system if you wanted to. And yeah, check it out. It's probably one of the best tools that I've discovered in recent times.
Awesome. Yeah, it's a great resource. Yeah, Nginx is particularly interesting because it's more like a programming language than I think Apache is. And I've done some migrations, and yeah, it requires some... I use programming language very loosely, though.
Well, I mean, it is something that the way that the file structure works, for example, and the way that you're supposed to put information in is very particular. It's what a developer might call as an opinionated framework. It tells you must do things in this way, otherwise it breaks, as I'm sure you've probably experienced.
Yeah, and there was like a weird thing where you couldn't do an if condition based on a negative condition. So you couldn't do if not this. And there was all these examples on how to get around that. I'm like, this is just bending the laws of physics and should never be done.
Yeah, exactly. And the other nice thing about it as well is, so even looking at like Nginx, they do have the ability to do different versions of software. So depending on Nginx might be not the best example here, but Docker is a really good example of different versions that have come out recently that you might want to have different documentation on. Or if you're like me and you tend to kind of, you're a mad scientist, you have your own laboratory of things that you're doing, you probably have different versions of documentation that are lying around based on the things that you're doing. And that's exactly what I've done here for my own setup.
Yeah, like the compose XML markup is the different versions are completely different in some instances. It's really annoying.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I don't know if you want to move on to the news. I know that we have quite a lot to cover. So the one that I really wanted to cover first was how, and this is actually it's a fictitious article that is written in the realm of truth. And this is based on my experience of working with Node and NPM packages, which is basically how someone, specifically a malicious actor, would go about introducing bad code or malicious code into the Node package management libraries, or for example. And then from there, if they got that ingested into other libraries, so for example, now the one that they use here is, I want to be able to colorize my console log output so that I can more easily read it. If I were to make that the package that I was introducing and then bundle it into other Node packages that everybody is using, I can suddenly take my one malicious package in the Node package management library and suddenly introduce it into things that people are actually using. And by doing that, I can obfuscate my code in a way that is potentially malicious and therefore could allow me to receive people's credit cards. So again, the whole article itself is an act of fiction. But when I was reading it, I thought to myself, yeah, this could actually happen, and it probably will be something that we end up seeing here in 2018 because, quite frankly, the whole idea of being able to just import a bunch of stuff and get my job done that much quicker without having to write a lot of code is more or less the way of DevOps in JavaScript as it exists today. So a little bit lengthier of an article. Definitely check it out and read it. Again, it is a work of fiction, but it's definitely grounded in some truth of things that I could see actually happening.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's scary at the same time. The next one is not unfortunately grounded in reality, which is Epic Games reporting pretty huge spikes in processing compute time as a result of the Meltdown Inspector patches to their cloud environment. In fact, in the two articles that I've cited here, they both have the same chart, and it shows the actual CPU utilization going from something like around 20-ish% to up over like the 50+% mark. So to the extent that if you're using cloud services today, post the release of those patches for Meltdown Inspector, go check your CPU utilization and moreover, go check to see how much you're spending. Because if you're doing some heavy computation as they are for hosting game servers, you're probably going to be doubling your cost just from this case, the actual patches that were rolled out to prevent the speculative execution vulnerabilities.
So they haven't figured out a way around that issue where patching it doesn't adversely affect performance.
Nope. So what it looks like in this case is
it's pretty epic. Ha, get it?
Right. Yeah. Poor for Epic Games, right? Like Fortnite, from everything I've heard, I don't play it myself, but some of my colleagues do, and they've spoken very highly of it. And it's kind of unfortunate that, in effect, for them to make the game as enjoyable an experience for their users, they were probably using that speculative execution pretty heavily, as was Postgres, for going back to databases for a moment. And as a result of the patches coming out, if that speculative execution is locked down, in this case, even like, maybe by a factor of 2, suddenly the actual CPU utilization doubles. And it's just a worst case scenario for a lot of cloud-based companies.
And so this CPU bug also affects CPUs on the video cards? Is that what NVIDIA drivers are fixing?
So yeah, actually, so it's in this case, NVIDIA is pushing patches for this, and it's you're correct. In this case, it's not the actual GPU chipset itself, or even the computing processors on the actual video cards. It's the drivers that interact with the CPU of the system.
Okay. Gotcha.
That is effectively being patched here. So to the effect that Spectre and Meltdown don't actually affect the GPUs themselves, their interaction with the CPU on the system, or on the motherboard in this case, is what needs to be patched, and that's the drivers between the GPU and the system itself, which is crazy, right?
It is crazy. And is there? Do you think there's a performance hit in your GPU now based on this driver update, or no? Because it's not the code that's running on the GPU; it's the code that interacts with the processor. You wonder if there's a performance hit now. Should we all go buy bigger video cards?
Well, if I said yes, I'm sure that everyone would be very happy about that, because they can have an excuse. Keith Hoodlet says you should buy a new video card because of this. So, honey, I need to
build a new gaming rig because Keith said so. Yeah.
Right. Well, so as much as I'd like to say yes, right now they're saying that there shouldn't be any performance hits to your GPU as a result of these patches. The one things that I always go back to is like the whole Radeon versus NVIDIA, right? Some people say, NVIDIA is great because of the drivers that allow you to get the best performance. They control the performance really well. Whereas ATI or the Radeons is like, yeah, you don't have very good drivers, but the chipset is really strong. And so to the extent that I imagine the interaction with the CPU on the system will have some performance hits, it's yet to be merited or drawn out per se, but we shall see.
Yeah, it's interesting. We got 5 years out of our system that does live streaming. I think is what the technologies, the CPU and motherboard and everything. estimates around 5 years old. And so we're building a new system with an i7 8700K, and like even just a $50 video card will suffice for, because we don't really need the video processing. There's a separate card that takes a feed into a PCI Express slot that sends it out. But we did put an external video card in it, and we did choose NVIDIA GeForce card, like a gig of RAM. It's like $50 just to offload that from the CPU. Because we need as much CPU as possible to do the live streaming. I mean, and that's all it does in life, is just stream stuff. So
I'd be really interested for, especially your use case, Paul, to see if you're seeing any performance hits as a result of the Spectre and Meltdown patches, because I know a lot of people who were talking about even just compiling things, right? So compiling using like Gradle and Java-based compilation.
Yeah.
Saw pretty significant increases in compilation times. I mean, from a factor of 5 minutes to 20 minutes, which is pretty significant. And if you're doing, I imagine that especially for companies like Microsoft who do pretty monolithic, compilation of their code into a single deliverable or binary, right? Like that's going to be pretty interesting to see how that all changes over the next 6 months.
Yeah, it's hard to tell if the problem's gotten worse because it is, it's basically older hardware that's running newer software, which probably, and actually in my reading, is tuned to take advantage of the newer processors. So even if there is a performance hit, will likely still be well under any threshold, because even just moving to an i7 platform, there's some processor feature that I can't remember the name of it, but they're like, you should definitely have this processor feature because we use it in our software. And it greatly helps performance. So,
as long as it wasn't speculative execution, I think you're fine.
It was not. I definitely would have recognized if it was speculative execution. I don't remember what it was, but yeah, it's it's software from Telestream. It's actually called Wirecast. So
very cool. That's actually really neat.
Yeah. Well, it'll be interesting once that system comes together. We can talk about it on the show.
Yeah, and that'd be actually really fun, especially because we can start to nerd out about all the different things you can do with it.
Absolutely.
One of the things I do want to, speaking of systems that are running important software, right? So the Oracle WebLogic vulnerabilities that were actually patched back in October of last year are now being seen as being exploited by Bitcoin miners, which I thought was kind of telling, right? Because in this case, if you have flaws of this nature 6 to 8 months ago, it probably would have been just ransomware campaigns. And it sounds like more and more that we're seeing everybody switch over to suddenly using those systems that are now being compromised to mine for cryptocurrency, whether it's Bitcoin or otherwise. And to the extent that Oracle's WebLogic here has one CVE 2017-10271 that is rated as critical. And to the extent that it's also in use largely by education institutions or educational institutions, is interesting to me because, as you know, Paul, from your history of working in the realm of education, patching systems is probably not a high priority on their list. And quite frankly, those systems are also probably pretty beefy because they need to support a lot of students. So I'd be interested to get your thoughts on patching in the world of universities and education.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember where WebLogic plays into the educational software market. I'm not sure what exactly it's used for in education.
I wonder if it's like student records, honestly, because it does say, web server or WebLogic server, PeopleSoft, Banner, Oracle Identity Manager.
Oh, okay. You said it. Banner is kind of like the ERP enterprise management for universities. So that's why most universities, to manage students, finance, financial aid, all of that stuff, will implement Banner in their back end as their enterprise platform of choice. Whereas enterprises, right, they're usually SAP or in other Oracle, a different set of products from Oracle. Well, probably a lot of the same back end stuff, but Banner packages that. Enterprise applications for educations. So that's why you're seeing it come from Ren ISAC, because it's heavily used in education.
Gotcha. And it's interesting to me as well because if you think about it, right? Like think about the dynamic change here. These are systems that are used for things like financial aid, right? They are literally handling not only students' PII but also money. And they're not
Yep.
being used. This vulnerability isn't being used necessarily to steal all of that information, and maybe it is, but that it's being used to now mine cryptocurrency
Yeah.
says a lot about the value of cryptocurrency.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they can probably make, well, fly under the radar, certainly, more so than stealing information and then selling it. They can fly under the radar more easily by just using it for mining and still make some money on it. That's probably would be my guess in the approach.
Yeah, yeah, probably. I mean, and that is it is kind of an interesting world that we live in, especially because of the fact that people that are basically handling cryptocurrency, right, seem to be doing it not so well. Specifically, Krebs or Brian Krebs on Krebs on Security calls out Coinbase for their handling of what is Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash, I believe, is the other one, is the fork. And I don't know if you managed to see any of this article. It was late breaking news, I think yesterday or 2 days ago. I'm happy to jump into it if you didn't get a chance to look at it.
Yeah, this is a Krebs article on a website glitch let me overstock my Coinbase. It's interesting.
Yeah, and effectively what it is in this case, at overstock.com, he could use or select Bitcoin as the payment method. But what he could then do is he would be able to change that payment method when he was going to check out to Bitcoin Cash. And Bitcoin Cash, comparatively speaking, is something like if you were to take $100,000 Bitcoin Cash in Bitcoin value, Bitcoin Cash is like $15,000, right? So for a $78 purchase, he was able to basically purchase it for what was equivalent $12 in Bitcoin Cash. And so to that end, his hypothetical situation here is if you spend say maybe $100,000 on a 3-carat platinum diamond ring, but pay for it in Bitcoin Cash for $15,000, and then return it to Overstock, they would return you Bitcoin, not Bitcoin Cash.
Gotcha.
So you would now make $85,000 in profit off of this, which is, again, it's like here you literally have the magic of 1 + 1 = 4.
Sweet.
So, yeah.
Hopefully they fix that issue.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Well, I mean, when Brian Krebs comes calling, he is the world's intrusion prevention system. So maybe, who knows? But it was kind of interesting to hear that come out because it's like, yeah, this is just a simple. People might have, like thinking about the way that this was developed on the back end, right? Maybe they didn't actually differentiate what was Bitcoin versus Bitcoin Cash and the mechanisms or the features that were handling payment. And at the end of the day, they just, they didn't cross the wires appropriately, or they didn't separate out those wires appropriately, and they were now crossed and on the front end and the back end.
I like how Brian tested this vulnerability and actually made some profit. I don't know how much exactly that was. It wasn't $85,000, right? It was like $77.80, it looks like. He offered to send it back to overstock.com, and they were like, no, just keep it. And he donated it to archive.org, which I think is awesome.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Brian. It's almost like he got it as a bug bounty, right?
Yeah, pretty much, right?
So that's awesome of him to put it out to archive.org. They're great people. So.
Absolutely.
More problems, by the way. So getting back to processors for a moment, AMD's chip internally, the PSP chip, which is built in as a security trust zone, has a remote code execution flaw built into it. So this went full disclosure on January 3rd over on seclists.org. So most people would refer to that as where you can get Nmap or get more information on Nmap. So it's basically the firmware trusted platform module is allowing you to go ahead and get stack-based buffer overflow, which was found based on the researchers doing static analysis of the actual processing languages.
We actually covered this on Hack Naked News this week. Doug White did an expert commentary on it to kind of, because everyone was talking about Meltdown and Spectre, and we talked about that with Jake Williams, aka Malware Jake, on Paul Security Weekly. Doug was like, I want to cover this AMD thing because it's kind of like flying under the radar, so I'm glad you added it here as a reminder. If you want more about that, and Keith, you're more than welcome to expound upon it, but Doug actually did a whole segment on it.
I'll defer to Doug in this case. I mean, I was looking at the actual vulnerability that they have and the proof of concept that they have up on SecLists, and yeah, the remote code execution against a processor that's a security trust zone inside of an AMD system, bad, real bad.
Well, and the crux of the issue was there was no ASLR, there was no NX bit. NX bit is the NX bit, right? Non-executing, so. Yeah, NX bit or Canary. Like none of the remediation features, I'll call them, to prevent stack-based execution were implemented in this particular coprocessor, as I understand it, which was kind of the scary part of the article.
Yeah, yeah. It's like, come on, guys. I mean, you'd think that it would be turtles all the way down when it came to security. They would do it at every level, but somebody dropped the ball here somewhere. So. Yep. PHP, by the way, is in none too good shape either. I know that they had some issues. I think it was, 2 weeks ago. I remember you had a PHP related issue on the Policy Security Weekly show notes. And so this is more of a continuation of badness. If you look at the actual technical summary, there is something like 20 or 30 bugs for version 7.2.1, 7.1.13, 7.0.27. It's bad. It's really bad. And to the extent that, remote code execution, or excuse me, arbitrary code execution, important distinction there. Arbitrary code execution is not remote necessarily. Mm-hmm. But to the extent that some of these bugs, looking at them, so for example, you have one that's remove file name from output to avoid cross-site scripting, right? Like that's something that you could potentially have real problems with if you have a non-admin user now being able to get cross-site scripting stored against other users based on like a file name that was stored in email attachment. Needless to say, these are all sorts of badness, segmentation faults. So again, it's like, okay, now you have denial of service that if you can get a seg fault on the web server, there you go, you're done. And if it's trivial, it's real bad. So,
it also looks like it affects PHP 5 as well.
Yeah, PHP 5.6.33. There's only a couple of them, so it's less so, but I wonder if that's because in this case maybe people didn't go deep into PHP 5 given how old it is at this point.
Correct.
So I imagine, well, kind of as WordPress is the Policy Security Weekly, I imagine that PHP will be a continued problem until eventually it goes the way of Flash, which is it never dies.
Pretty much. I mean, to run WordPress, you still, of course, need PHP. I don't see that. It'd be interesting to rewrite WordPress in a new framework.
JavaScript. Basically, it would be JavaScript if it was going to be done that way. But.
Right? Yeah, it would be some kind of like Angular Node thing. I just, it's going to be so much time until something comes even close to the ecosystem that WordPress has created for its user base. So we're going to be, in my estimation, stuck with PHP for a long time, unfortunately.
Probably true. And I know that we're going to be wrapping up here in a few minutes, so we're going to skip over the Western Digital MyCloud series of vulnerabilities. All I will say is there is an unrestricted file upload that is remotely exploitable. There's a hard-coded backdoor, which we talked about last night on Policy Security Weekly. Also, cross-site request forgery, which I think 2 weeks ago on Policy Security Weekly I said is kind of going the way of the dinosaur. Maybe not.
Yeah, not in IoT-based systems.
Right. And it's interesting because that also cross-site request forgery was dropped from the OWASP top 10 in the 2017 model. So who knew? But yeah, command injection, denial of service, information disclosure, bad. So needless to say, go check out that in the show notes because it's not good. The JSON RPC or JSON remote procedure call. This is something where an Electrum wallet, which is a wallet repository for cryptocurrency that exists out on the web, right? So it's kind of like Coinbase, for example. In this case, they were remotely exploitable via JSON RPC calls from a web server. So your JSON or your Electrum wallet could be given instructions if you had a browser open for your Electrum wallet and you went to a website that leveraged this JSON RPC exploit. So again, badness in general. The ones that I wanted to close out on specifically, though, is that a new cybersecurity office has been proposed, which for companies like Equifax, if this had existed in the shape and form that it was brought up in legislation, the fines that Equifax would have been hit with as a result of their breach would have been upwards of, I think, if it didn't have a cap, it would have been $14 billion, but it
That's
would have
pretty
been capped
significant.
Yeah, no kidding. In this case, the actual legislation is a 50% of the company's gross revenue for the previous fiscal year. So yeah, I think in this case ended up being like an equivalent 1.5 billion if this had existed as legislation and this office had existed. But it goes to show that especially our representatives in Congress and in the Senate are not joking around when it comes to making sure that you're doing security for your organization. And as we see application security becoming more and more the forefront of security breaches and in this case also security practices that need to take place, we're going to probably see a lot more investment in this space. So stay tuned.
I just feel like the fine amounts are somewhat interesting. Like if it's not enough, as was the case with the FTC and VTech, it was like $650,000. That's not enough of a kind of a threat to the business to force them to make major changes. Maybe it is, and we have seen evidence that we talked about where when fines do come down that category or industry, other players are like, well, I want a bug bounty program and I do want to make changes. If the fines are too much, I don't think that, I think in legal battles, they'll be like, you can't put us out of business with a fine because we made a mistake. And they'll probably work to show, how they can either were more diligent than it appeared on the surface and how they'll be more diligent in the future to get those fines down. Because, you can't, again, force a company out of business because they had a security vulnerability. Now, of course, there's a lot of factors that play into that, a lot of different scenarios. But I don't think that the government is going to force a company to go out of business because they had a security breach. Who knows? Maybe they could, but I think that in legal, with various legal teams and large companies, that certainly that's going to be taken into account and be fought.
And I would say that the most important thing about this particular piece of legislation that they've put forward is specifically to companies like Equifax that, in this case, are managing PII that is effectively your whole life, right? So it's not every single company that would fall into this, but it's the Data Breach Prevention and Compensation Act is designed to affect companies that have a good deal of your information. So not just Paul Security Weekly lost its list of registered listeners, for example, right? Like that wouldn't be something that would be a 50% gross revenue event for you based on this legislation. Which is, but still though, for the really big organizations out there, it's kind of like GDPR, right? Like if this gets passed, even in some form, if it's not a 50% of gross revenue, and that's like the high point for negotiation purposes, even if it's 25% or 10%, that's no longer a small number,
right?
Like 650,000, like VTech was. The last one that I wanted to wrap up on, though, Paul, if you wanted to do just one more.
Okay, let's do it. Just one more.
Was the it's kind of like the Steve Jobs one more thing.
That's right.
So the one more thing of today's episode is a Microsoft Secure article on application fuzzing in the era of machine learning and AI. And I thought it was interesting because as companies are moving to the left, right, they're trying to get implementations of security, SaaS and DAST tooling in place to actually scan for vulnerabilities before it's ever released or even built in some cases. This is an article that talks about how things like machine learning and AI can be leveraged to continuously fuzz applications for vulnerabilities, even including things like neural fuzzing is what they call it at the very end of the article. So I will leave our listeners with that. Definitely go out and check out that article. If you're looking at what the next 5 to maybe 10 or 15 years of application security looks like, I think that this is going to be a part of it. So put this on your radar.
Sweet. Well, Keith, thank you very much for this awesome episode of Application Security Weekly. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching. We'll see you next time.